Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome to my first video using some of the new products from the Simon Says Stamp Believe in You release that I literally just posted a release and review video of not too long ago. So I'm starting with the Daisy Bouquet stamp set. This was released a while ago. I've already done a video on it, love this set. But the new aspect of it is Simon listened to all of our demands and they released the coordinating wafer dies for it, which always makes me so happy. So I am white heat embossing this great big bouquet onto distressed watercolor paper onto the smooth side of watercolor paper. And these are the pre-cut 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch pieces. So you can see just how big this stamp is. Like, it's huge. It covers like an entire card. So I use my anti-static powder tool. And I'm trying to make a point of using my little, like, not little, it's huge, the Tonic fan brush, just to kind of remove some of the excess anti-static powder, because I seem at times to get a little heavy-handed with the anti-static powder, and that gets in the way of the actual stamping. So a lot of times when I find I didn't stamp my image, you know, the image wasn't stamped properly, or there's spots it didn't pick up the, you know, ink, and then there's no embossing powder sticking there, that's usually why. So I'm trying to make more of a point of stamping with the clear ink, or like using my anti-static powder and then brushing off the excess, then stamping my image, then heat embossing it. So that's what I did with the bouquet. And then I also stamped one of the individual flowers in the set onto another piece of the watercolor paper, melted that all with my heat tool. Once I've done that, while I have everything out, I'm also going to stamp the new, this is the SCALLOP Waves background stamp. And with big background stamps like this, most of the time I like using it how I always have, which is just face up on my work surface. So for stamps and like regular images, I like to use, you know, my MISTI, a stamp platform, etc. But with background stamps, I find it's just so much easier to just flip them over, have them face up, still use my anti-static powder tool on the watercolor paper or cardstock, whatever I'm using. And I'm going to ink up my stamp with the clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to flip my paper over onto the stamp, press it down with my fingers. If I'm using any other ink other than like clear, like pigment inks, black ink, whatever, I'll use copy paper just to prevent the ink from getting like all over my fingers and me smearing it absolutely everywhere. But with this, I'm not too concerned about it. So I go around with my fingers, making sure not to let the cardstock shift at all, and then coat it with embossing powder. And love it when I get like a perfect impression. Sometimes it's not perfect. I'm not too concerned about it because I'm either going to trim it down or I just don't, you know, worry about it. But those are rare times where it literally stamps perfectly. It's just like a win. So coated this as well with the white embossing powder, and like everything else, it looks like nothing. When it's white on white in a video, you can't see really anything. But I just wanted it for like more of the texture, because I am going to watercolor it so that it shows up a bit more. But it was more just for that little bit of pattern and texture. So for the watercoloring, I decided to pull out my Altenew watercolors. I haven't used these in a while, and I need to do swatches of them. That's my only, not a gripe, but like all the darker colors there in the pan, they're very difficult to tell what they are. This is why you need to swatch your things. Swatch your inks, swatch your watercolors, etc., etc. I know all this. Do I do it? No. It's on my to-do list. And with this set especially, I definitely need to, because I'm not familiar with the colors. So I had to kind of fiddle and figure out like what color was what and what I needed. And then I just did a bunch of mixing, because I'm kind of going with the colors of the Sunken Treasure Sequin mix. I really like the color combo. It's not something I would normally just think of on my own. So that's kind of what inspired this entire card, was that sequin mix. So I mixed up kind of a lighter blue to paint over this background, and painted it on really messy. Quickly dried it with my heat tool, not doing anything too fancy here. I only wanted it dry so I could add a bit more of the watercolor, just to give it, you know, that texture and the layers and the splatters and all that fun stuff. So I just quickly dried it with my heat tool and then just slapped on more color. Not going for anything specific, just wanted lighter areas and darker areas to give it that fun kind of textured background. And then once I was happy with it, I just set it aside to dry. So for the actual flowers, I did speed, well, I always speed up my videos, otherwise we're going to be here all day. But with the flowers, I was inspired by the kind of peachy color of the sequins in the mix. So I kind of mixed some of the dry watercolor that was already on the lid of my watercolor palette, and then I just kind of mixed up and added some more color to it. And then if you've watched any of my videos, I have mentioned many times, I have a very heavy hand when it comes to coloring, watercoloring, everything. I really struggle with keeping things, you know, that really pale look, lots of highlights, etc. It's something I do not do very often and that I really struggle with. So this time I actually worked harder towards getting the colors light and pale and layering them. So right now it doesn't really look like much of anything. I'm just going in really, really lightly and painting the daisy petals with just a very, very light wash of that color and not covering each petal, just kind of keeping all the color more concentrated towards the centers. And then after I do my first layer, I go in with a second layer, and I've just kind of picked up a bit more of the watercolor, a little less water. So then I get more darker areas. And I just keep building this way, just going along and doing one flower at a time. And it still didn't even take that long, because with an image like this, there's more of the lines, the more of the, and whether you've stamped it or heat embossed it, than there is of the actual petals, if that makes sense. But I went along, and as I couldn't leave it like really pale, I wanted still a bit more intensity. So I went in with another layer and just darkened it even more, and I really like that because it just kind of helped everything pop a little bit more. So went in and added a darker shade, which basically was just mixing it up a little bit darker, not as much water, more color so that it's a little more intensified. And then I finally went in and then I did centers with just one of the browns that was on the lid. And then I decided to paint the stems with a brown as well rather than green, just to go more with that sequin mix. And I don't know, I just wasn't feeling the green for this card. So I just did it with brown because why not? So once I was happy with it, I painted the individual flower in the exact same way. Made sure both of them were completely dry, and then used the coordinating wafer dies to die cut these, which just made me happy because I will fussy cut if I have to, but I would rather not. I much prefer wafer dies. That's how it's always been with me. So tape those into place, run those through my die cut machine so that they are die cut. And then for my card base, went through my cardstock stash, and I have this Lawn Fawn. This is apricot cardstock, and it was like the perfect shade to go with this whole like color combo. So I cut a sheet of that in half, and then while I had my paper cutter out, I also trimmed off some of the edges of the background I had heat embossed with the Scalloped Waves background stamp. And just trim this down so it was slightly smaller than an A2 card front, so that I'll have a bit of that, you know, peeking around the edges to frame it. So trim that down, and then I also grabbed just a smaller piece of that apricot cardstock, and I'm going to stamp a sentiment from the new Greetings Mix 1 stamp set. And I pulled out some Simon Says Stamp Coral Reef ink and rubbed my finger on the stamp because it's like basically a solid stamp and it's brand new. So to get it to like take ink and so it stamps smoothly. So ink that up with the Coral Reef ink, stamp that onto the apricot cardstock, and then I'm going to die cut that with one of the nested circle wafer dies that is slightly larger than the stamp itself, which is kind of nice because it gave it that little extra, you know, like frame of the cardstock, which I thought just finished everything off. So I'm going to score my card base here at 5.5 inches. So this ends up being an A2 top folding card, so 4 1/4 by 5.5. And then for the inside of the card, I have that flower that I had stamped and heat embossed, and I pulled out another sentiment from that Greetings Mix 1 stamp set. And I'm just going to line this up again in my mini MISTI. It doesn't matter that the rest of the card's like just hanging off like the lip on the top there. That's fine. Line that up, ink that up with that same Coral Reef ink. Then I'm going to stamp that onto the inside of the card. Once that's stamped, I can adhere this individual flower just using some craft tacky glue. So I had thought about just stamping the, you know, floral images on the inside because that's what I did, I think, with my last video. But I was like, I have the coordinating dies now. I don't have to do that. So with this, and also because I wanted to do a color card base, I thought it would be kind of nice to have like the watercolor flower just to give it that little extra something. So I adhered that to the inside of the card, and then I'm going to adhere the watercolored background as well with that craft tacky glue. So that's adhered flat. And then the actual like bouquet of daisies, that I'm going to pop up with the Big Mama foam tape from Simon Says Stamp, which again, if you're not familiar with this foam tape, it's slightly thinner, or not slightly, it's about half as thick as the regular 3M foam tape that we like to use. I just like using this stuff because, yeah, it gives it that little extra dimension, but it isn't too bulky. Just depends on my mood and what I'm going for. So I coated the back of this with that foam tape, peeled off all the backing, and then popped this onto my card. Once that's in place, I can flip this over and just trim off the bits that are hanging off the edge so that this still fits in a standard A2 envelope. And then I'm going to adhere my sentiment into place with that craft tacky glue. And then finally, of course, I'm going to adhere a bunch of the sequins from the mix that inspired this entire card. So I just poured these out into one of my little sequin trays, and then I'm just gonna like kind of sprinkle these throughout the background and then adhere them into place with that same craft tacky glue, just using my jewel picker. And once that's adhered, this card is done. So as always, there'll be links below the video to my blog post. I'll have a supply list with links to all the supplies I used. So if you're interested in any of that, you can check that out in the description box below the video, as well as on my blog. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!